Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started today. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and you are joining for another edition of Committee for Sydney Live. Today, I am delighted that we are going to host a conversation with two experts on climate change, a topic close to my heart, and a topic that is a core area of focus for the Committee for Sydney. And I guess it's fair to say a topic where we have our work cut out for us, where we have still a very long way to go. At the end of last year, just before the bushfires, ironically, Australia was ranked 61 out of 61 countries for its climate change policies. Whether you think that's fair or not, we can perhaps discuss, but that is what at least one reputable global organization found. We have become very interested in the committee. We've become very interested in the UK as a counterexample. And I think there's probably at least three reasons for that. One, the shared political heritage means it's easier to translate policy solutions from one country to another. So that's important. Two, the fact that the Tories have become a party of climate change, and therefore climate change has become, in a sense, depoliticized. We keep wondering if there is a strategy that the climate movement can employ to help that to happen in Australia. Third, the UK has actually made enormous progress. It's well beyond plans and strategies and into implementation. It has actually gone through successive rounds of learning and revising and improving. So, so it's a leading country, even if those other reasons weren't true. For all of those reasons, we're very pleased today to be hearing from two of the leading experts on this topic. First, we will bring up Mike Thompson, who is the Chief Economist and Director of Analysis with the Committee on Climate Change, which is the independent statutory body set up in 2008 to support the UK government in its response to climate change. Following that, we will bring in Kieran Power, who is the National Lead for Resilience and Climate Change for WSP Australia, to help translate this into the Australian context. And then those of you who have been doing this know how it works. You can ask questions via the Q&A app on Zoom, and I will sort through those, and we'll see where that goes. So with that, Mike, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and hello everyone from the UK. We're in a very strange situation over here, which is normally preserved for Ashes series, that we're praying for rain. We just had the sunniest May on record. It's barely rained here since the start of lockdown a couple of months ago, and that's come hard on the back of floods and the wettest February on record. So we have a growing climate awareness over here. You know, where you've had the fires, we've had the floods, and it looks like we may be heading towards drought at the moment. So the population here are demanding more. We thought we were doing quite well in the UK, and then last year we've increased our level of effort as well. So I'm going to talk about what the UK is doing, and I'm going to talk about what we're doing more compared to what we were doing, and particularly trying to pick up those points that Gabriel has made there, get into the politics of how have we managed to make that happen, why is that happening, and how have we managed to build a consensus around this. Now, I'm going to talk for a little while, so I've got some slides. I'll just try and get those up now. There we go. And I've called this locking into climate action and throwing away the key. That's not quite right. We haven't thrown away the key, but we've given it to the scientists. And if the science on climate change tells you anything, it tells you have to act hard and you have to act fast. So, it kind of comes to the same thing, really. So I'm going to talk in just three sections, basically. I'll first of all just give you the background of the Climate Change Act, where it came from and how it works. And then I think this second section is that bit for getting into, well, how have we got to a position of consensus? Most of the actors in the UK agreed that what we're doing is basically the right thing. And then the last section I'll talk about net zero. So this is the response we've had to that growing public desire for action. This is what we now are doing in response to that and in response to the Paris Agreement. And I always like with an international audience to start with this slide. So this is probably the UK government's favourite slide as well on climate change. And it just shows that, you know, there was this notion out there that climate change was an anti-growth policy. You couldn't tackle climate change and still grow your economy. And what you see on here is, well, actually the UK has had GDP growth that has been better than the G7 average. And at the same time, we've had the highest reduction in emissions in that time, going back to 1990. You can draw a similar line back to when the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008. And actually, the GDP growth is not great since 2008, but the emissions reduction is very good. And the GDP growth there obviously is affected by the financial crisis, not by what we're doing on climate change. It still performs just as well against the global averages. So, you know, there really isn't anything to be afraid of in terms of climate change. We absolutely can cut our emissions and grow our economy at the same time. Oh, there we go. And the background, of course, as you know, is that the world is warming and we need to act. And this was understood well enough a decade ago, 2 decades ago, for British politicians to get together and to say, well, look, actually, let's stop talking about whether we should act. The question here is not whether climate change needs a response. The question is, what should that response be? So we have a kind of background, I guess, in the UK that the consensus has been that climate change is happening. It is human induced, and that the only way out of it is to act seriously to tackle our emissions. We had alongside that a thing called the Stern Review that was led out of the UK Treasury, the Financial Ministry, and that review looked at the economics of climate change. That was in 2006. And Stern looked at, well, what are the costs of acting? What are the costs of not acting? How do those stack up? And concluded very clearly that the costs of inaction vastly outweigh the costs of acting. Therefore, not only do we need to act, we should act. And that then led to the Climate Change Act in 2008. The politics of this, I'll just mention as well briefly. This was adopted by both the incumbent government, the Labour government of the time, and by the Tory government. This was David Cameron in opposition, trying to rebrand the Tory party after a decade of Labour government, rebranding it as a Green party. This was vote blue, go green, hug a husky, all those things were going on. And pushing for a Climate Change Act was all part of that. The interesting thing then was that once the Climate Change Act came into the Parliament, the implementation of it ended up stronger than those initially pushing it expected it to be, because it has in its nature the idea of being led by the science. And so once you've agreed on that idea that we will be led by the science, we will do what we should do, then actually incremental steps point you to something which in the end is pretty stringent. So the Act has in its legislation, and it is a very well written Act, it's a useful model. It has essentially 4 parts to it. So first of all, it says, right, we're going to recognize the problem and we're going to commit to dealing with it. And it does that through a commitment on the mitigation side, on reducing emissions, a commitment to reduce emissions by 2050. That was originally set at least 80% and has since been increased to at least 100% to that net zero target. And on the other side, it has a commitment on adaptation. It says, but we also recognize the climate is changing and we need to adapt to that. So it requires a climate change risk assessment. And then for both of those, it requires that you don't just recognize the problem and commit to dealing with it, you actually plan to deal with it. So we don't expect politicians to respond very well to a commitment for 30 years' time. That isn't how politics works, of course. So we have the nearer term targets on the mitigation side. That's carbon budgets. So those are 5-year stepping stones. I'll show you those in a second. On the way down to that 2050 target. And on the adaptation side, it's a national adaptation plan that says, right, given those risks in the risk assessment, here are the actions that we will take in the nearer term in order to prepare for meeting those risks. But a plan, of course, doesn't get you anywhere on its own. Plans are important, but themselves, they don't achieve anything. So the Act has in it a requirement that the government actually acts to deliver on those plans. So you don't just set targets. Having set a target, you are legally obliged in the legislation to bring forward policies in order to deliver the targets that you have that you have set. And then finally, the fourth bit, again, we recognise the future is uncertain. We're planning against lots of moving variables here. On the economics, on the technologies, on just the success of policies. So we will have to be flexible. We will have to change the way we do this as we go. So it has a requirement there for the Committee on Climate Change, the independent body tasked with advising on all of the earlier steps. It has a requirement on us to monitor progress, to act as a watchdog, and every year to say, this is what is happening, this is what the government is doing, and this is what needs to change. And then again, it has a requirement on the government to respond to those progress reports. So it's quite a neat set of arrangements. At heart, fairly straightforward in terms of how it works. And we're saying it has been adopted in quite a few other places. I was over last summer to advise the New Zealand Climate Change Committee that has just been set up. And to help get their Climate Change Act over the line, which is very much modelled on the UK Act. And it maintains these 4 points and actually goes a little bit further, if anything, on point 3 here. The New Zealand Act is slightly stronger in terms of the policy requirements. It's slightly stronger in terms of what those need to look like, and also with a stronger role for their climate committee on advising on it. So this picture is just to show you what that looks like in practice. The black line here is the historical emissions. You've got annual on the left-hand side. You've got the 5-yearly average, 5-yearly emissions on the right-hand side. And you can see the green line is basically going to our old 80% target. And the blue line there is heading towards where the new target, the 100% target. And the grey blocks are the carbon budgets. So as I say, those are stepping stones down to 2050. And clearly, if you keep hitting the stepping stones, then eventually you will hit that 2050 number. And you can see that the first 2 budgets have been met fairly comfortably, but there's still quite a bit of work to do towards the 4th and the 5th ones there, particularly as we expect those to have to be somewhat tighter. We expect to have to do better than the legislated numbers there, because they've been set on that green line on the path to 80%. Ultimately, we need budgets on the line to 100%. And my committee will advise on those later this year. This is our committee, a very cheerful committee, and they do enjoy their work. And the important thing here is that they're not an interest group. They're all appointed for their expertise, largely academics, led by Lord Deben, who is the former longest serving Environment Secretary. He was Margaret Thatcher's Environment Secretary when Thatcher went to the UN and said what a risk climate change was. Then she described herself and Lord Deben as in a majority of 2 in the cabinet at the time in believing that climate change was something that required acting upon. But the others are all academics. Apart from Rebecca Heaton, who is a business rep on the committee, who is a sustainability manager at Drax, who is a large power station using biomass. And there's an interesting mix of expertise on here, which is worth mentioning. a couple of climate scientists, so Pierce and Corinne on here, a fiscal expert, so Paul Johnson there is a former head of microeconomics at the UK Treasury, now head of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. We have a behavioural expert, Nick, and then experts in the transport sector and the energy sector, which are the two biggest sectors in the UK, in Baroness Brown and Keith there. And we have an increasing expertise on land use, which both Rebecca and Corinne cover there. So they bring these expertises rather than particular interests. And the other crucial thing is that they're properly supported. We have a good sized team of analysts. So my team has 20 to 25 analysts in it, working full time, doing analysis, producing evidence, and allows us to be small enough knit that we can fit all the bits of the problem together, but large enough that we can be quite a powerful analytical unit in terms of pushing forward the evidence base and making the case for our recommendations. And then a key part of our model has been that it's been very transparent. It's been transparent in terms of publishing all of our work. We've published over 70 reports since we were created just over a decade ago. And those have covered a real range of topics. So some of these are the straightforward statutory advice. What should the carbon budgets be? What is progress towards them? But also advice on particular topics, so hydrogen, bioenergy, advice on particular policies, so reforming the electricity market to increase shares of low carbon power, and reports on the impact. So what are the measures that we're taking doing to energy bills, for example? What are they doing to competitiveness? And I'll pull up a couple of interesting charts from those later. And this isn't just about reporting. This is very much about the way that we work as well. So it's been a very collaborative effort in the CCC. We talk very extensively with the stakeholder base. That can be the academic community and the commentators, the researchers. It certainly is government and parliament. So we do make efforts to talk to MPs more generally, not just the sitting government. But crucially, it's business. By far the largest number of conversations we have are with businesses who will be affected by the policies and ultimately tasked with delivering the targets that we're recommending. And that has allowed us to garner really extensive buy-in to our work. Okay, that's kind of enough, I think, on the CCC and on our model. Happy to take any questions on all of this later. If we get into then building consensus, I'm just going to show you some of the work that we've done and how we've gone about this. A key part of this has been the transparency. It has been about lots of conversations, talking about the work that we're doing, trying to identify what people's issues are, and then bringing analysis to look at those and say, well, look, is that a real issue? Is it something that can be dealt with policy? What does it mean when we get down to the numbers, to the science, to the evidence? And I'm just going to rattle through some of these. So the first is this myth that the country couldn't afford it. I said that was the UK government's favourite chart at the beginning. Well, this is it again, because actually the first place that appeared was in a climate committee report, because we thought, look, this is a myth that is out there, and it's not true. So we included this picture to just demonstrate as simply as possible that you could grow the economy and cut your emissions. The second then really important one in the UK was a story out there that the UK couldn't afford this. There were front page headlines in various of the red top newspapers about your energy bills are going to go up by £1,000 as a result of actions on climate change. Green crap is adding hundreds of pounds to your bill. And again, we thought, well, let's look at this. Let's look at what the actual numbers are. And let's put the actual numbers out there. Let's have an evidence-based discussion about this. And we can talk about whether this is true and then what the right response is to it. And what we found actually when we did that was that it wasn't true at the levels that were being described. And in fact, more than that, the measures that we'd had that were primarily targeted at tackling climate change had actually cut bills more than they had increased bills. And that reflects that two things have happened. We've had some measures on the side of pushing up bills. Primarily, that's been about renewable policy. We're spending £10 billion a year in the UK, so that's, I guess, 20 billion Aussie dollars on supporting renewables in this country. So that is, and that is being passed through to consumers in their energy bills. So that is clearly pushing up bills. But actually, when you spread it across all of the consumers, it's actually only adding a relatively small amount to each person's bill. And so it's only increased their bill a small amount. And that's the green bits on the bars in the middle. I appreciate these charts are a bit complicated, and given time, I don't want to get into it too much. So the green bits going up in between are the additions from climate policy. And you've got on the left-hand side, the increases historically. We were looking at this in 2008. And then you've got on the right-hand side, this is the historic period split into two parts, sorry. First, before the Climate Change Act to 2008, and second, after the Climate Change Act to 2016. But also we've had policy to improve energy efficiency. That's been products policy, so it's been in requiring that we replace incandescent light bulbs with fluorescent light bulbs. It's been in legislation on boilers to make those more efficient, on fridges, washing machines, etc. And actually those have cut consumption and therefore cut bills for the same level of appliances far more than the renewable policy has added to bills. So actually what we see is that over time, bills have come down as a result of climate policy more than they've gone up. Now, of course, they could have come down further if you hadn't also had the renewables. So we're very careful to split these out and not just bundle them together. But by far the dominant thing across here has been gas prices. So the dark blue, the bigger blocks in the changes here, those are gas prices fundamentally pushing, which have risen a lot since 2004. And that, I think, because that has happened at the same time as climate policy has been coming in, it's been very easy for commentators to point to that and say, right, climate policy is the thing that's driven things here. But actually, if you step back, you break down the numbers, that is not it. It has actually been gas prices have pushed things up, and then the small addition from climate policy has been more than offset by the reduction from energy efficiency. So the other crucial myth, I think, and this I think is maybe the most powerful part of the UK story, is that we've managed to build a huge business coalition around climate action. So we've bust the myth that climate action is somehow anti-business, and I think this is more than anything what has driven the Tory party to really embrace this. I think that, and actually the popular demand for action that we now see out there with this particular government at the moment. And the reason for this is fairly simple. You know, a lot of the companies that we talk to, they may say they produce gas turbines at the moment. Some of them then also produce wind turbines. And what they want is certainty. They want predictability. They want to know where policy is going. And the Climate Change Act has been fantastic for that, because it is led by the science, and because it is written into the law that it must be led by the science. So businesses can look at what the Climate Committee is doing, and they can see a clear line from this is the science, this is what it demands, this then is what policy will have to do. And that predictability has been hugely valued. And actually, I think since the creation of the Climate Change Act, policy development in energy more generally has been much more evidence-based than it had been in the period before. The next one then I want to cover off is that we can't be competitive. If we tackle climate change, we'll pass these costs not just onto households, but also onto industry, and industry therefore won't be competitive. Now, I've pulled up a chart here. This chart was from our very first report, actually. And it was trying to tackle this by looking at it two ways. It was trying to demonstrate that, well, actually, for most industries, climate policy isn't adding that much. And for those industries it is, they're not actually that big a part of the UK economy. So these are the kind of energy intensive sectors in the UK, and they're only about 1% of UK GDP. This didn't really land, actually. This was not the right way through this problem. It doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter, I think, whether you're at 0.5% or 1% or 5%. You don't want to push your industry overseas. It's as simple as that, right? And however small it is, there will be factories that can be seen being closed, and that is a terrible look for politicians. So it's not, you can't argue it this way, actually. I don't think this is a very effective route through it. The way through, actually, in the end, has been much more to talk with these industries and establish with them, look, this shift to zero carbon is ultimately inevitable. This is where the world is heading. This is where the UK will head. We have a choice. We could either agree that's where we're heading now and make sure we bring in policies that mean we can deal with the competitiveness impacts of that. So, for example, exempting energy intensive industry from climate costs. That's what we now do in the UK. Or we can go down a route of burying our heads in the sand and waiting for this to come and shock us later. And the former is much more preferable. So the way through this really has been to shift the conversation from what are the costs, how can business deal with it, onto what are the policies? How can you deliver climate policy in a way that you are not pushing your industry overseas, that you are not endangering its competitiveness? And then the final one I've got here is just this myth that no one else is acting. We hear this story that the UK is only 2% of global emissions. It used to be 1% of global emissions now. Therefore, we can't make any difference. What's the point? And we've just tackled that head on to say, well, look, first of all, the notion that we're the only ones doing this is absolute nonsense. We've got now about 120 countries around the world that have set net zero targets. Also, look, that story only works in a world where you think the costs are huge. Well, we don't think the costs are huge. We think the costs actually are relatively small. And given that point that, you know, the shift here is ultimately inevitable, better to be ahead of it than to be behind it. And of course, this is even more true in a world of the UK being the host of the COP, and the UK talking about global Britain. We are talking about international leadership, and climate is something we have done quite well. And so it is an opportunity for the UK to bolster that international leadership and that global profile. Right, I'm conscious I'm probably taking a bit too much time, so I'll rattle through the net zero work here. The key thing I want to get across here is that this was deliberately a positive vision, whilst also very clearly grounded in the analysis and in the evidence, as all the rest of our work is. The background was both the kind of growing climate awareness that I mentioned at the start, but also, of course, the Paris Agreement. So our old ambition was aligned to a 2-degree target. The Paris Agreement, of course, goes further than that. So it's clear that we needed to do more in the UK. And we approached it through two means. We approached it from, the question of what's the right level of ambition from the UK, but also what can we do from the UK? So we're always trying to tell this story of what we should do and what we can do, and make sure that we're very clear that what we are doing is feasible, that it's credibly deliverable, and that the costs of it are not excessive. We want there to be a positive story coming out from the end of this. We want to continue that story of growing the economy and cutting emissions. And just this one, you'll probably be familiar with, the Climate Action Tracker chart. And I don't want you to focus just here on the gap, actually. I think people tend to look at this and say, well, we're heading for those blue lines, something around 3 degrees, but actually we're meant to be on those yellow and green lines, and there's such a big gap between them. The point we tried to bring out in this report is, yeah, absolutely, and that's why we need to do more. But let's not forget that we were heading to that grey line. We were heading to that grey area and to 4 or more degrees of warming. And so actually, action is happening. Action is making a difference. It is nowhere near where we need it to be, but it is pushing in the right direction. And again, part of trying to have this balanced story that is recognising both sides of what's going on. And the other crucial thing there, of course, is technology. So the big story here in the UK has been offshore wind. When we did our first reports back in the late 2000s, we thought we were being really optimistic. You know, we were saying that offshore wind could come down to £100 a megawatt hour by 2030. And we thought that was probably pretty bold. And you go back and these projections look ludicrous now. We've just signed contracts at £40 a megawatt hour for the mid-2020s, so 5 years earlier than we thought and less than half the price. And this is genuinely now competitive with fossil fuels in the UK and, of course, in many parts of the world. This I mentioned, so to really emphasise the importance of what we could do and what we should do, we actually did 2 reports when we recommend on net zero to sort of to pull that out, and there's about 300 pages on each, so I'm not going to go through all of those. Something I just wanted to draw attention to was people often say, well, the world needs to get to net zero in 2050, so surely that's not enough for the UK. And so this is just making the point, yes, the world needs to get to net zero CO2 in 2050, but the UK target actually is for all greenhouse gases. That puts us about 20 years ahead of where the world needs to be. And again, trying to pull out that leadership theme, it's worth, this looks kind of terrifying at a global level, going from that upward line on the green down to that red line. And just trying to demonstrate, well, if you shift that to looking per capita emissions, which allows you to compare better across countries. And if you just overlay the UK line on there, you can see actually, you can see that the UK is quite a useful example actually on a global basis here. We have been cutting emissions at roughly the rate that is required in per capita terms, and we're actually now about global average in terms of our emissions. So if we can keep that going, we can deliver that target, we're really demonstrating what's needed internationally as well. Right, I had a slide here on how the net zero scenario can be delivered. I propose for time, I won't run through this, but the point of it is that it's a bit complicated. There's lots and lots and lots to do. It's not just about our energy use, it's also about our land. It's not just about big kit and building offshore wind, it's also about engaging people and getting into to changes in their homes and the cars they drive. And yeah, as I say, there is an awful lot to do. And a couple of key things we pulled from that report was that to deliver this, you've got to grasp it and you've got to lead it from the centre. The Prime Minister has got to take control of this, and you've got to coordinate all of these many changes across the economy. And then this is kind of the last slide before I come to a conclusion. Just to finish with the costs. We think actually the target here is going to cost us about a year of growth. So by 2050, our GDP would be 1 to 2% lower than it would have been. So instead of doubling by the start of 2050, it'll have doubled by the start of 2051, say. So if you imagine the lines of growth, they're very, very similar with and without climate action. And the really interesting thing here is that we used to think that an 80% target would cost 1 to 2% of GDP. But of course, as those technology costs have come down and beaten our expectations, we're able to do more at the same cost as we thought before. And then an interesting game you can play here is you can guess, well, what did we used to think a 60% target would cost? We used to have a 60% target before the Climate Act came in. And no massive surprise here, we used to think that was about the same sort of order. So the story here is of induced innovation. Once you actually aim for something and you go about it, it has a much lower cost than you might expect. And then you can add into that, well, actually, you get quite a lot for that. You're not just tackling climate change, you're also getting lots of co-benefits. So better air quality, more green space, things people have really appreciated here during the lockdown. You potentially have a better growth path because you're on that path to the inevitable global response. You're building the economy of the future, not the past. And you can induce more innovation in technologies like offshore wind than we've been able to with fossil fuel extraction. And then I was just going to close by mentioning the COVID response. And the key point really here, I think, is that they can enforce each other. So there are lots of jobs in the climate measures that we need to take. And those jobs can help us with the recovery at a point when labour will otherwise be underused. Accelerating the climate programme is a chance to build back more jobs more quickly and build back better. And then this I thought I would conclude with this slide just to kind of look at, well, what's actually happening in terms of policy. and a lot is happening at the UK level, and that is where we focus as the Climate Committee. We've got stuff at the national level, so we have not just a new target, but we have a cabinet committee to deliver it, a treasury review of funding, an infrastructure strategy on the way. We've had a climate assembly to establish what people want. We have innovation assessments in terms of what's needed. And then we are working towards a strategy that has a full policy package for all sectors. And when I say a full policy package, I mean it has direction and standards, regulation. It has markets, taxes, subsidies to drive the changes that are needed. And it has a set of enabling measures. And I would consider innovation support as one of those enabling measures, rather than a full policy per se. And then within that, we have policies at the devolved level, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then lots and lots of local authorities declaring climate emergencies, setting their own net zero targets, and cities proving to be really, really crucial in this. City regions with quite helpful powers in this space, and also with an ability to look slightly further longer term, and to cover a lot of the actors that are very important. And of course, across all of this, business is doing a huge amount. And I think that's something that is somewhere we want to go further as a climate committee, is to work much more through about how businesses setting their own net zero targets, their own goals, how that can support and dock with the policy making process. The model has tended to be very kind of top-down policy leadership, but of course what we're seeing emerging is much more bottom-up, businesses pushing for action, businesses setting their own goals. And so in a sense, the challenge for policy is sometimes to keep up with that, actually. And I guess the point we now have in the UK, because we have that overarching policy, and because we have businesses, communities, local authorities, cities all looking to act, we have quite a coherent structure. And so we are able to say, look, this is in the law, this is what the future will look like, and so this is what we all need to be doing. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We're going to bring Kieran in now. I think you're muted still.
Hi, everybody. Be with you in just a moment once I find my slide. Thanks very much for the introduction, Gabe and Mike, for your words too. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I think in the interests of making sure there's time for some questions, I think we're a little bit behind. I'll try and whip through my presentation quite quickly. I am WSP Australia's National Lead for Resilience and Climate Change, and at WSP we've been working quite closely over the last few years with the Committee on Climate Change and various different pieces of either policy advisory work or research in the areas of climate change mitigation and adaptation. But that's not really the angle I want to bring to this. I think really what it's worth doing over the next 7 or 8 minutes is really just, I guess, trying to focus on and maybe highlight a few areas where the experience that Mike has shared is potentially quite relevant to Sydney, New South Wales and Australia more broadly, but then also to acknowledge where there are some difference and where, you know, we might need to go our own way. And then also I just want to touch on some of the ways in which potentially Sydney currently doesn't benefit, but potentially could benefit from a more nationally coordinated approach to climate change. And I guess, you know, ask the question really, is this something we should be advocating much more strongly for? So I'd always like to start with the answers to the quiz first. So in terms of the messages I hope you'll take away, I think, you know, the key difference that we need to acknowledge is our economic mix is different, and that does make, you know, create different challenges to those that the UK has been through. But some of the examples that Mike shared there around the CCC as a myth-busting organisation, I think are really quite instructive for us. Even in the absence of a net zero target and sort of accompanying policies at the federal level beyond and emissions reductions targets beyond 2030. Sydney and New South Wales are forging on, businesses are forging on, but what are some of the risks and sort of trade-offs that and things that will fall through the cracks without this kind of federal approach? So take a moment to pause, or only a quick moment, because we are short for time, and think about where you were in 2008. What were you wearing? Where were you? What were you doing for a job, for example? Because I think what it really will underscore for you is just how much of a head start the UK does have on us in terms of having the ability to formulate this more measured and consensus-based policy environment around climate change. So, I mean, just to really drive home the point, Amy Winehouse was still alive, for starters, and the #1 on our music charts in 2008. Barack Obama, for most of that year, was not yet US president. Morris Yema was New South Wales Premier for some of the year, Nathan Rees for the rest. And Ross Garnaut, during 2008, released the first of the Garnaut climate change reviews, the second coming in 2011. So a lot's happened since then, not necessarily a lot to advance a consensus-based approach at the federal level. So I just wanted to call back to one of Mike's slides really here to I guess underscore one of the key differences we have. And I thought it was quite helpful for Mike to demonstrate that this is one of the ways the UK CCC has tried to kind of, and maybe not succeeded in telling the story for why climate change isn't something to be feared from a business perspective. But if you look at the sort of scale on the x-axis here, it really suggests that manufacturing here for all of these different industries contribute only 1% of GDP for the UK. In the UK, in Australia, we'll very rapidly have it. It's stated to us that a single extractive industry in terms of iron ore exports contribute 3.3% to Australia's nominal GDP, and you can't argue with that. That is true. However, I guess in keeping with the point Mike made before around the fact that the world is headed towards this lower emissions future regardless, when you think about it, the most energy and emissions intensive parts of the steel production value chain actually are occurring overseas, because we export most of that ore. So it's actually other countries' approaches to carbon pricing that are arguably more relevant to, and present a greater risk to that industry. And in fact, I think it was Professor Garnaut who was recently talking about the fact that really we have an opportunity in Australia to potentially bring more of that value chain back on shore, coupling it with a push for more renewables, so that we can actually be producing low and no carbon aluminium and steel. So I won't touch on this. I won't linger on this one for too long in the interest of time, except to say that this example that Mike gave us, I thought was particularly poignant for Australia, as the risks of climate action pumping up our energy prices at a household level is one of the key fears that is cited amongst those proponents of delayed or slowed response to climate change. And here, Mike, articulated a pretty compelling way of making that case. But I think what's interesting here is it's not as though we don't have the evidence, and there aren't a range of organisations in Australia that are already advocating and kind of making this point. So it's not about a lack of information or evidence, but rightly or wrongly, we are marred. Climate change has been drawn into the culture wars to a large extent in Australia, and therefore we do lack organisations that can come at this without being, I guess, accused of coming at it from either a left or a right perspective, coming at it with baggage. And really, we do lack that in Australia, and we're not going to get that overnight. The CCC has taken a lot of time to build up, I guess, that trusted position in the UK. But that being said, it's important to note that this body sort of exists in Australia. It should exist in Australia. And many of you might be familiar with the Climate Change Authority. For others, it's the sort of greatest little organisation you've never heard of. And it was established in 2011 with the mandate, and this comes from their own website, to provide independent expert advice on climate change policy. And to the CCA's credit, that's exactly what they do. But there is a disconnect between that advice and how that translates into federal policy. And a case in point is a paper that was released in March, sort of under the cover of COVID-19 to very little fanfare, that really lays out a range of quite practical and broad-based recommendations about advancing climate policy at the national level. And indeed, there are some recommendations about how that can be done at a more coordinated way between states and territories. And there's a link down the bottom there to that. I'd really encourage you to go and look at that, because that's sort of the unabridged version of where climate policy, from an expert perspective, suggests we should be headed. Now the challenge is that doesn't transfer through into papers like the one released last month, which is the Technology Investment Roadmap discussion paper, which again is actually something that is trying to do something that Mike sort of touched on before around inducing innovation from a tech perspective, but it's doing it in the absence of an emissions reduction target. And so there is this challenge, there's this disconnect between the independent advice and the policy going forward. And a lot of that has to do with the way our legislation is drafted. So in the interest of time, I'll skip through this because the majority of you will be from New South Wales, so you'll understand that the New South Wales government has designs for net zero, and it is upping its ambition in that in the net zero plan stage 1. Similarly, initiatives like Resilient Sydney look at not only climate resilience, but resilience to a broader range of shocks and stresses. City of Sydney is looking at a net zero buildings, energy buildings pathway, and some of my colleagues at WSP and Elton Consulting are supporting on that. This is all happening. It's good stuff, but ultimately, in the absence of a coordinated national approach, things are going to fall through the cracks. And again, the first point here on the screen links very closely in with a point Mike drove home before around an absence of policy consistency and stability, ultimately undermining confidence for investment. And that pulls through to everywhere in Australia, but particularly in our cities. And then the other points, both of which have been driven home in not overly well publicised reports by the Climate Change Authority over recent years, relate to, I guess, inefficiencies in having multiple systems at state levels. So, for example, for energy efficiency, there are so-called white certificate schemes, and companies that are operating in multiple jurisdictions ultimately have increased costs associated with using those schemes. And similarly, a net zero approach that is piecemeal across different jurisdictions and a transition towards renewables does have the risk of destabilising what is ultimately still a nationally connected energy market and grid. So I think that'll just about do. So we still have time for questions, but I guess I wanted to throw this one out there as well. In the absence of a federal net zero policy and target, it's great to see that the business community is really pushing forward with a much more proactive stance around climate change in many cases. This is often driven by measures, programs such as the Principles for Responsible Investment or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I mean, this is to be welcomed in my view. However, ultimately, can we deliver the most optimal outcomes through approaches that are really about individual corporations managing their own risk, may either physical exposure to climate change risk or risks associated with the transition to a low carbon economy? My view is probably not. And things like the PRI help to kind of pull together those disparate, disconnected kind of individual organizational strategies into a sort of shared direction, but what's missing still is the federal direction. And so I won't touch on these, I'll just leave these on the screen for now, but I thought this is a really great thing that the UK CCC has really been pushing over recent months, and it really relates to the concept of resilient recovery and 6 principles that it's really hard to argue with around how climate investments can be part of that recovery pathway. So thanks, Gabe.
Okay, thank you both so much. There is a lot there for us to digest, many questions coming in. I will ask these questions quickly, give quick answers so we can get through a few of them. Okay, what exactly is the disconnect? When you say you didn't throw away the keys, but you gave it to the scientists, why is the Australia Climate Change Authority advice not self-enacting, but in the UK it is?
In a sense, that's hard for me, isn't it? Because I don't know your local circumstance enough to comment on the CCA. I mean, a clear advantage for us is that we were established in the legislation, so there is an act there that says the government must listen to you, right? They can't just ignore us. We're not just the body that is putting stuff out there. We are a statutory body with a role in the legislation that the government has to respond to and has to respond in Parliament. And I guess secondly, we've been going for 12 years and kind of built this up over time, I guess. And we're well resourced. I mentioned that point that, we've got 25 analysts, a serious, strong core team and a research budget to match. So yeah, that kind of gives us an advantage. All right. I will mention as well, we have made real efforts to engage with the media, to push this story externally, to not just be a channel to government.
In essence, even in the UK, it's just advice to Parliament, but it so happens that the politics are such that they're taking the advice.
So the government has to tell Parliament, if it doesn't agree with us, why it has to set out to Parliament why it disagrees with us and on what basis it is not doing what we said. So there is a presumption towards doing what we say.
Yeah. Okay.
There's no legislative requirement for that in Australia.
I don't know the answer, Kieran, but I don't think so.
No, there isn't. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. A question about natural gas. The Australian government believes that natural gas is a bridge to renewables. I think environmentalists do not really think that so much anymore. Discuss, Kieran.
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one, especially in the New South Wales context, as obviously there's been recent announcements that do tether the state to natural gas as a transition fuel. You can see why it's the case from, I guess, an economic perspective, but my personal view, and my strength is mostly in the resilience side of things, but is that it doesn't seem to me, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest it's a particularly viable way to go forward, particularly beyond 2040.
Mike, do you want to, how are you guys thinking about the role of natural gas?
If it is a bridge, it better be a short one, because there isn't a lot of time out there.
And the reason is because it generates a lot of greenhouse gases.
Yeah, yeah. And also,
people used to maybe not know that.
But in a world where solar power is as cheap as it is, why bother as well, right? I mean, let's go straight to renewables, given they're already as cheap, right? The quicker we move to them, the better, definitely.
Yeah. A question about displacement. How much in the UK have your policies led energy intensive industries to relocate outside of UK, and so they're not counted within your emissions, but that displacement doesn't actually reduce overall emissions for the world?
Yeah, so it's hard to identify any evidence that has actually happened. What certainly has happened is that our growth in consumption of manufactured goods has been largely met by imports rather than by growing domestic manufacturing. So our manufacturing output has been pretty flat actually since 1990. And also most of that time, we haven't actually had a lot of climate policy. We haven't had costs flowing through to industry. So there's no reason to think that there would be a displacement. But certainly our story has been slightly easier because a lot of the imports have met that need for increasing consumption.
Many of us have suggested that Australia's response to COVID suggests how to respond to climate. Listen to the scientists, explain hard issues to the public, spend money to help affected groups of people. Is that naive, Mike, or could that really be could that actually lead to a change in direction?
I mean, I think it's spot on, actually, and I think this is really a moment around the world for us to say, look, there are risks out there. That climate change is, it seemed a lot far off, but we know now enough that it isn't that far off, right? You've seen the fires as well. We've seen the floods, and there are things we can do to both reduce those risks and to prepare for them. And I think COVID tells us that, look, you're much better preparing for risks than you are trying to deal with them when they come burning down your house.
Yeah. Kieran, you expressed skepticism about the efficacy of business-led action on climate change, and that's certainly something you hear a lot in Australia. We don't need to reduce digging up thermal coal because people will stop buying it from us at some point. And so we can let the market work that out. Why are you skeptical?
So it's not so much that I am skeptical of actions taken by business, but I am skeptical of actions that are taken by business in the absence of leadership, in terms of, I guess, there being an appropriate kind of unifying framework or direction around how businesses can best support the national interest as it relates to emissions reduction and resilience building. I think as it stands, we run the risk of an approach where business, takes this leading role, and what we're left with is a series of disconnected actions that don't really achieve the outcomes we're after. But business have to be part of the action.
Yeah, certainly in Australia, there's been extraordinary business leadership on climate change. And yeah, it's actually one of the reasons for optimism, I think. All right, let me just say a closing question.
Can I add one very quick thing,
Oh,
Gabriel?
yes, Mike.
Just to say that the Bank of England here has identified transition risk as a fundamental risk across the economy. I would look at a sector that is energy intensive, carbon intensive, and contributing 3% of your GDP through exports, and say, look, what is the future for that industry? Because if it's not going to be a low carbon future, then you've got a problem. And so I think this is as much an economic policy as it is a climate policy now.
Yeah, that's very wise advice. Well, look, that's a good segue then to maybe the final question. What's the open-ended? What's the advice for Australia? What should Australia try next? Mike?
Goodness. I mean, as long as the next step is in the right direction and it's as big as you can make it be, that's all you can do, right? I don't know what the right next step is, but it has to be towards better building an economy which is going to be low carbon, because that's the only way that you're not going to bottle up another risk and move from one crisis to another.
Kieran, any thoughts on the next big step for Australia? Get
behind states, get behind cities. They're already doing this as best they can, and we need to support that. Beyond that, I think hopefully this is one of many small actions that are kind of advocacy actions that can nudge us towards something more meaningful in terms of this unifying federal framework. I haven't given up on that being a possibility, and I think it's important that, from my perspective anyway, we're agnostic about who does it. I actually want the outcome, and I'm not going to kick up a stink if the outcome, whoever delivers the outcome, doesn't necessarily wear the political Guernsey that I would probably go to the polling station and vote for. I'll take a win from whoever.
Yeah. All right. Thank you both for making time to share your thoughts, and thank you both for devoting your big brains to the problem of the climate transition in your own work. We all benefit from what you're doing. Everybody else, thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks for having me.